June 1940. Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader stood in the assembly yard at Stalag Luft 1, near Bath on the Baltic coast, watching new prisoners arrive. The late afternoon sun caught the dust rising from their boots as they shuffled through the gates. RAF pilots shot down over France, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Bader counted them instinctively. 37 men. Yesterday, 22 had arrived. The day before, 41. The numbers kept climbing. He'd been captured himself 3 weeks earlier, his Spitfire shot down during the evacuation from Dunkirk. At first, the camp had felt almost empty. Maybe 200 British prisoners total, mostly aircrew from the early months of the war. Room to move, space to think. The Germans ran the camp efficiently, but without particular hostility. It felt temporary, a holding area until some prisoner exchange or armistice brought everyone home. But watching these new arrivals, exhausted, defeated, confused, Bader felt something shift. This wasn't temporary. This was the beginning of something much larger. Behind him, a pilot named Jimmy James walked up, lighting a cigarette with hands that still trembled slightly. "How many today?" he asked quietly. 37. Maybe more still coming. James exhaled smoke slowly. "Do you think anyone back home knows? I mean, really knows how many of us are here?" Bader didn't answer immediately. He looked at the new prisoners being processed, at the expanding rows of barracks being constructed beyond the wire, at the German guards who no longer looked surprised by the daily influx. "I don't think anyone knows," he finally said. "Not the scale of it. Not yet." What British prisoners would discover over the coming months would transform their understanding of the war, their place in it, and what survival would require. The realization that they weren't isolated cases, that Germany held not hundreds but tens of thousands, eventually over 150,000 British prisoners, would reshape everything about camp life, resistance efforts, and the psychological weight of captivity that might last for years. To understand the shock British prisoners felt as they realized the scale of captivity, you have to understand what most of them expected when they were first captured. The early prisoners, those taken in 1939 and early 1940, had been told by their training officers that if captured, they'd likely be held for a few months at most. The war would be short. Either Britain would win quickly, or some negotiated peace would bring prisoner exchanges. POW camps were temporary inconveniences, not long-term prisons. This belief held even as Germany conquered France. British soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk thought the disaster was a setback, not a catastrophe. RAF pilots shot down over the Channel believed they'd be home by Christmas. The idea that they might spend years, potentially the rest of the war, as prisoners simply didn't register. Then, the numbers started climbing. At Stalag Detecce in Poland, Lance Corporal Peter Vaux arrived in July 1940. Part of a group captured during the fall of France. The camp already held several thousand British prisoners. New groups arrived daily. Vaux, who'd been a clerk before the war, started keeping informal records, counting new arrivals, tracking which units they'd come from, noting the dates and locations of their captures. By August, his counts showed over 8,000 British prisoners at XXA alone. And prisoners whispered about other camps, Stalag 7B, Stalag XXB, dozens of smaller camps scattered across Germany and occupied Poland. If each camp held thousands of men, the total had to be enormous. But no one knew for certain. The Germans didn't publish figures. The Red Cross hadn't yet established reliable communication networks. Letters home took weeks or months to arrive, if they arrived at all. And Britain, fighting alone after the fall of France, had bigger concerns than precise POW counts. So the prisoners counted themselves. In camps across Germany, men like Vaux kept records in margins of books, on scraps of paper hidden in false-bottomed tins, in memorized lists that couldn't be confiscated. They compared notes when prisoners were transferred between camps. They tracked new arrivals, noted which regiments had been captured, calculated rough totals. By autumn 1940, the more mathematically inclined prisoners had reached a disturbing conclusion. Germany probably held between 40,000 and 50,000 British prisoners, maybe more. At Stalag Luft III, the camp that would later become famous for the Great Escape, squadron leader Roger Bushell listened to these estimates during an evening gathering in the barracks. The numbers seemed impossible. The British Expeditionary Force had evacuated 300 to 38,000 men from Dunkirk. How could 40,000 or 50,000 have been captured? But the arithmetic was undeniable. The BEF had initially numbered over 400,000 men. Subtract the evacuated, subtract the dead, and you were left with prisoners. Tens of thousands of them. If that's true, one pilot said quietly, "We're not going home soon. They can't exchange that many men. They won't." The room fell silent. The realization was spreading through the camps like a slow-moving shock. This wasn't temporary. They weren't going home by Christmas. They might not go home for years. And the numbers kept climbing. Through 1941 and into 1942, as Britain fought in North Africa, Greece and Crete, the prisoner population exploded. At Stalag AVB in Lambsdorff, one of the largest camps in the German system, Sergeant Major Charles Coward watched the transformation. When he'd arrived in 1940, the camp held perhaps 5,000 British prisoners. By mid-1941, that number had tripled. By 1942, it had quadrupled. The camp expanded constantly. New barracks appeared monthly. The perimeter fence moved outward, encompassing more land, more watchtowers, more wire. Working parties of prisoners were sent to construct satellite camps, smaller facilities attached to factories, farms, mines. The German camp system was becoming an archipelago, a network of labor camps stretching across occupied Europe. Coward, who spoke German and had developed relationships with some guards, began asking questions. How many British prisoners did Germany hold? The guards wouldn't give precise numbers, but they dropped hints. More than you think. Enough to rebuild Germany after the war. Your entire army is here. In the officer camps, the stalags reserved for NCOs and enlisted men were separate from the lufts for airmen and Auflags for officers. The calculations became more systematic. Officers with mathematical or statistical training created elaborate estimates based on partial information. At Oflag 70C in Laufen, Major Pat Reed compiled data from every source he could access. Red Cross lists, letters from other camps, debriefs of newly arrived prisoners, observations of German administrative systems. His conclusion, shared quietly with other senior officers, was staggering. By late 1941, Germany probably held over 80,000 British Commonwealth prisoners. The number felt unreal. That was multiple divisions' worth of men. That was a substantial portion of Britain's pre-war regular army. That was enough prisoners to change the strategic calculus of the war. But more disturbing than the number itself was what it meant about British military performance. If Germany held 80,000 prisoners, that meant 80,000 defeats, individual and collective. It meant British forces were losing battles faster than they could win them. It meant the mythology of British military competence, already damaged by Dunkirk, was being systematically dismantled by arithmetic. In letters home, heavily censored, carefully worded to pass German inspection, prisoners tried to convey the scale. There are more of us here than you might think. The camp keeps growing. We meet men from regiments we didn't know had been captured. But the censors cut anything too specific, and even if the letters made it through, families back home struggled to understand the implications. Britain's newspapers, focused on maintaining morale, didn't dwell on POW numbers. The government released occasional updates, vague references to thousands of brave men held prisoner, but nothing that conveyed the actual scale. The War Office knew the approximate numbers from Red Cross reports, but those figures were classified. Publishing them would reveal just how badly British forces had performed in the early years of the war. So the prisoners lived with knowledge their families and country didn't share, that Britain had lost an army's worth of men to captivity, that the camps were vast and growing, and that no one was coming to get them any time soon. The full scale of British captivity crystallized in stages through moments when individual prisoners confronted the totality of their situation. For Flight Lieutenant Sidney Dowes, the moment came in spring 1943 at Stalag Luft 3. He'd been transferred from another camp and spent his first day exploring the compound. The camp was massive. Multiple compounds, hundreds of barracks, thousands of prisoners. RAF pilots, bomber crews, fighter pilots shot down over Germany, France, North Africa. That evening, he attended a meeting of the camp's intelligence committee, a group that collected information about German defenses, military movements, anything that might be useful if they ever got home. The committee chairman, a squadron leader named Roger Bushell, opened with a status report. Gentlemen, based on our latest information from new arrivals and Red Cross communications, we estimate the current British Commonwealth POW population in German hands at approximately 120,000 men. The room went quiet. Someone in the back said, "That can't be right." Bushell didn't smile. "It's conservative, actually. That's counting only confirmed POWs in established camps. It doesn't include men held in civilian prisons, those reported missing who are probably captured, or the working parties scattered across Germany that we haven't been able to track." Dowes did the math in his head. 120,000 men. That was more than the entire BEF strength at Dunkirk after subtracting casualties and evacuees. That was an army, a whole army, sitting in camps, waiting for a war to end. "How does no one know about this?" someone asked. "How is this not the biggest story in Britain?" "Because publishing it would be admitting defeat on a scale that's difficult to justify," Bushell said quietly. "The government can't tell the public that we've lost 120,000 men to captivity without explaining how, without acknowledging that we've been losing battles consistently for 3 years. In the silence that followed, the prisoners absorbed what this meant. They weren't isolated cases. They weren't even a significant minority. They were a substantial fraction of Britain's military manpower, sitting uselessly behind wire while their country fought on without them. For some, this realization was crushing. They'd held on to the belief that their individual captivity was somehow unusual, that most British soldiers were fighting successfully, that their personal bad luck or tactical errors had landed them here while the majority remained free. Learning that 120,000 others shared their fate stripped away that comforting illusion. For others, the scale was almost liberating. If this many prisoners existed, they weren't failures, they were casualties of a larger pattern. The shame of capture, carried individually for months or years, diffused slightly when shared among 120,000 men. But for the camp leaders, men like Bushell who organized escape attempts, maintained discipline, planned for eventual liberation, the number changed everything. An escape that might save 10 or 20 men seemed pointless when 120,000 remained behind. Any resistance effort had to account for the scale of the problem. And the number kept growing. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, the German POW system held over 150,000 British Commonwealth prisoners. The camps had evolved from temporary holding facilities into permanent installations with their own economies, hierarchies, and cultures. At Stalag Luft 6, on the Baltic coast, prisoners organized a census. They wanted precise numbers, not estimates or guesses, but actual counts of how many British prisoners Germany held. The camp's senior British officer, Group Captain H.M. Massey, authorized the effort. Prisoners compiled lists from every source available: Red Cross records, prisoner transfers, letters from other camps, reports from working parties, German administrative documents smuggled by sympathetic guards, or prisoners working in camp offices. The project took months. The final tally, completed in early 1944, showed approximately 168,000 British Commonwealth prisoners in German hands. Some camps were enormous. Stalag 7B held over 20,000 men. Others were tiny, work commandos of 50 or fewer prisoners attached to farms or factories. But they added up to a staggering total. Massey read the report twice, then called a meeting of the camp's senior officers. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss what this means for our approach to captivity." The discussion that followed was recorded in smuggled notes that would later make their way to British archives. The officers debated whether to continue organizing escape attempts when success meant abandoning over 160,000 men. They debated whether resistance efforts, sabotaging German production, gathering intelligence, were worth the risk of reprisals that might affect thousands. They debated what they owed to the prisoners who would inevitably remain in camps, even if some escaped. There were no easy answers. Every choice came with a calculus weighted by scale. An escape that might have seemed heroic when camps held hundreds of men felt more morally complex when camps held hundreds of thousands. But the scale also created opportunities. With so many prisoners scattered across Germany, intelligence networks could span the entire country. Messages could be passed, camp to camp, information compiled, resistance coordinated. The very size of the prisoner population, once a source of despair, became a potential resource. Prisoners working in German factories began systematically sabotaging production. Not dramatic explosions that would trigger investigations, but small acts repeated thousands of times. Tools accidentally broken, materials wasted, work performed slowly. Multiply those small acts by 50,000 prisoners in work commandos, and the impact was significant. Intelligence gathered in camps. German troop movements observed by prisoners, factory locations noted by working parties, railway schedules memorized, was compiled, encoded, and smuggled to Britain through clandestine channels. The prisoners weren't fighting, but they were working. Their captivity had become a form of warfare by other means. Yet the psychological weight remained. Lance Corporal Jim Witt, who'd been captured in 1940 and had now spent 4 years as a POW, wrote in a letter that made it past the censors. "We number in the tens of thousands here. Some days that makes it easier. You're not alone. Other days it makes it harder. If there are this many of us, how can Britain possibly win? They're fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and we're the hand." In early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied forces from the west, the German POW system began to collapse. The orderly network of camps turned into chaos as prisoners were evacuated ahead of advancing armies. At Stalag Luft III, 10,000 prisoners were forced to march westward in January 1945. The Long March, as it would be called, covered hundreds of miles in winter conditions. Men died from exhaustion, cold, starvation, but they marched because staying meant being overrun by Soviet forces, and neither the Germans nor the British prisoners knew what that would mean. During the march, prisoners from different camps finally met in person after years of communicating through smuggled messages. Men who'd been compiling lists of POW numbers could now compare notes directly. The scales they'd suspected became undeniable reality as columns of prisoners merged on snow-covered roads. Squadron leader Richard Churchill, marching with a group from Stalag Luft III, recorded in notes hidden in his coat, "The roads are filled with British prisoners, thousands of them, columns stretching for miles. We thought we knew how many of us there were. We didn't. We couldn't have imagined this." As they marched past refugee columns fleeing the Soviet advance, past retreating German military units, past burned villages and bombed factories, the prisoners saw something they'd been trying to imagine for years. Germany was losing. The war that had seemed eternal was ending, and they had survived to see it. Liberation came in stages. Some camps were freed by Soviet forces in January and February, others by American forces in March and April. British forces liberated camps in northern Germany in late April and early May. Each liberation was unique. Some peaceful, some chaotic, some complicated by German guards who didn't know whether to surrender or flee. At Stalag 357, liberated by British forces on April 16, 1945, soldiers of the 11th Armored Division rolled through the gates to find over 8,000 British prisoners waiting. The liberating troops had expected a few hundred at most. They weren't prepared for the scale. A British captain, seeing the enormous crowd of prisoners, turned to his sergeant. "Jesus Christ, how many of our men did they capture?" "All of them, sir," one of the prisoners said quietly. "They captured all of us." In 1946, a year after the war ended, the War Office published official statistics. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany and Italy had held approximately 192,000 British Commonwealth prisoners of war. Of those, roughly 165,000 had been in German hands at the peak in 1944. The numbers were met with surprise by the British public, who hadn't realized the scale of captivity during the war. Newspapers ran articles. Survivors gave interviews. The stories of camps, escapes, survival, and suffering became part of Britain's war narrative. But for the prisoners themselves, these official numbers were redundant. They'd known, they'd counted, they'd lived it. Douglas Bader, asked in 1968 about his time as a POW, was quiet for a moment. The interview was for a television documentary about the air war, but the question had turned personal. "When did you realize how many British prisoners Germany held?" the interviewer asked. Bader, sitting in his London office, looked out the window at the rebuilt city. "I think I realized it slowly, over months. First you count the men in your camp. Then you hear about other camps. Then prisoners get transferred and tell you about where they've been. The number builds in your mind. Hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands." He paused. "But the moment it really hit me was during the Long March in 45. We were on a road near Lübeck, and I could see prisoner columns ahead of us and behind us. British prisoners as far as you could see in both directions. And I thought, this is just one road. There are dozens of these marches happening across Germany. Hundreds of thousands of us all trying to get home." "What did that feel like?" "Lonely," Bader said. "Which sounds strange. How can you feel lonely in a crowd of thousands?" But I did. Because it meant Britain had been fighting without us. For years, they'd been fighting without over 100,000 of their soldiers, sailors, and airmen. We were sitting in camps while our country struggled on. That's a particular kind of helplessness. The interviewer asked if he felt the British government should have done more to communicate the scale of captivity during the war. Bader considered the question. "I don't know. Publishing those numbers would have hurt morale, would have made people question whether we could win. But not publishing them meant families didn't know. The country didn't know, and we prisoners felt forgotten, I suppose. There's no good answer." In British National Archives, files on POW administration reveal the government's thinking during the war. Internal memos show officials debating how much to reveal about prisoner numbers. One memo from 1943 notes, publishing accurate POW figures would necessarily require explaining how so many men were captured, which would involve acknowledging significant military defeats. Recommend continued policy of general statements without specific numbers. The policy was practical but painful. It meant prisoners lived with knowledge their families didn't share. It meant the scale of captivity, one of the war's defining facts, remained hidden until after victory made it safe to reveal. Years later, historians would calculate that at its peak, Germany held roughly 2.5% of Britain's entire population as prisoners of war. That percentage sounds small until you remember it represented almost entirely military-age men, a substantial portion of the generation that should have been fighting but was instead sitting behind wire. Peter Vaux, the lance corporal who'd started counting prisoners at Stalag Taktix A in 1940, was interviewed in 1989 for an oral history project. He was 72, retired, living in Cornwall with fading memories of the war. "Why did you keep counting?" the interviewer asked. What was the point? Vaux thought for a long time. Someone had to know, he finally said. The Germans weren't telling us. Our own government wasn't telling our families, so we counted. We kept records. We told each other. Because if no one knew how many of us were there, it was like we didn't exist. And when you finally got accurate numbers, when you realized it was over 150,000 men, it hurt, Vaux said quietly. But it also helped. Because it meant I wasn't alone. None of us were alone. We were a whole army. Imprisoned but not broken. Still British. Still serving in our own way. Still there. He looked at his hands, age-spotted now, trembling slightly. People remember the battles. They remember D-Day, El Alamein, the air war. They don't remember as much about the prisoners. But we were there too. 150,000 of us. We counted ourselves because no one else would. And when the war ended, when we came home, we knew something most people didn't, how close we'd come to losing, how many of us had been taken, how the war had been won despite an entire army sitting uselessly behind wire. Do you think about them often, the other prisoners? Every day, Vaux said. Even now. I think about the men I counted, the lists I kept, the numbers that grew month by month until they stopped seeming real. 150,000 men, all of us waiting, all of us hoping, all of us coming home eventually. He smiled just slightly. We counted ourselves. And in the end, every single one of those counts mattered, because every number was a man, and every man came home. The official records show 192,000 British Commonwealth POWs total. Of those, approximately 12,000 died in captivity. The rest survived. The rest came home. The rest lived long enough to tell their children about the camps, the counting, the years spent waiting for a war to end. They counted themselves when no one else would. And in remembering them now, we count them still.